Welcome to Dice and Quills, where the art of storytelling meets the roll of the dice. I am Darren Ruckle, professional game master and TTRPG writer, here to share the craft behind world building, adventure design, and running unforgettable games. Whether you're a fellow creator, an aspiring pro, or a lifelong player, you're in the right place. So sharpen your quills, ready your dice, and let's dive into the worlds we imagine. Today we're diving into one of the most uncomfortable, misunderstood, and absolutely essential skills in professional GMing: saying no. You've probably heard the advice before. Say yes more. Yes and? Let the players lead. Collaborative storytelling means going with the flow. And that's good advice, until it isn't. Because the truth is, there are moments when saying no isn't just acceptable, it's necessary. To protect the tone of your game, to keep the table safe, to maintain pacing, to uphold your boundaries as a professional. Today's episode is going to explore when to say no, how to say no, and maybe most importantly, why saying no doesn't make you a bad GM. In fact, it's one of the marks of a great one. I used to struggle with this, especially when I was starting out as a paid GM. I didn't want to disappoint anyone. I wanted to be cool, flexible, chill GM who would improv anything, accommodate anything, allow anything. And guess what? I burned out. Hard. Because every yes has a cost. And if you're saying yes to everything your players want, chances are you're saying no to some important things. Your time, your energy, your prep, your tone, your other players. This episode isn't about being rigid. It's not about power tripping. It's about clarity, boundaries, the invisible structure that holds your game together so that everyone, including you, can actually enjoy it. So the next few segments, we're going to talk about what kinds of things GMs should be saying no to, how to frame a no in a way that doesn't shut down the player, when to hold firm and when to offer alternatives, what saying no looks like at the table in Session 0 and behind the scenes, and why clarity, not permissiveness, is the real foundation of trust at your table. Let's get into it. Let's start with the obvious question. Why is it so hard to say no, especially when you're getting paid? It's hard to say no because we're taught, both culturally and professionally, that good service means accommodation, that the customer is always right, that flexibility is a virtue. In a lot of ways, that's true. The best games are collaborative. They're built on trust, on improvisation, on shared enthusiasm. But here's the part we skip. A game is not a product. It's not a menu. You're not a waiter taking orders. You're a facilitator of a shared experience. And that experience has structure, tone, boundaries, rules, not just mechanical ones, but social, emotional, and narrative ones. And when a player pushes against those boundaries, intentionally or not, your job is to respond. Not to punish, not to scold, but to hold the shape of the game. Because someone has to. Here's what I've learned after thousands of hours behind the screen. When you say yes to everything, the players don't feel more empowered. They feel untethered. They don't know what kind of story they're in. They don't know what the tone is. They start pushing harder, faster, more absurdly. Not because they're trying to derail the game, because they're looking for the edges. And if they can't find them, they start to disengage. Saying no isn't about control. It's about containment, direction. It's what allows the game to hold tension, to carry tone, to build momentum. And the sooner you internalize that, the sooner your games start to breathe again. I want to be clear. Saying no isn't about being adversarial. This isn't you versus the players. This is you protecting the table, the vibe, the pacing, the fiction, so that everyone gets to play inside a meaningful shared structure. Let me give you a few examples. A player wants to cast a spell that doesn't quite work the way they think it does. They say, "Can I just do it anyway? Like cinematically?" And you want to say yes. You really do. But the way they're describing it would fundamentally break the scene, or bypass the tension, or undermine another character's moment. That's a no. Not because you're being difficult, but because you're protecting the scene. Another example, A player says, I want to steal from the other PC while they sleep. You pause. You know this isn't the tone of the game. You know it's going to cause friction. You know the rest of the table didn't sign up for PvP. That's a no. Or maybe someone says, can I multi-class into this homebrew subclass I found online? And you read it. It is completely unbalanced. Doesn't match the tone. Breaks your world's logic. That's a no. And here's the thing. No is a kindness. It tells the player what game they're in. It tells them what kind of story you're all building together. It gives them clarity. And clarity is what keeps people invested. Next, we're going to talk about the three main categories of no. The mechanical no, the tonal no, and the boundary no. And how to identify them in real time without second-guessing yourself. Let's start with the mechanical no. This is the one most GMs are familiar with. A player tries to break a rule, stretch a power, or exploit a system in a way that doesn't align with how the game is designed. Sometimes it's intentional, a min-max combo that ignores action economy. Sometimes it's accidental, a misunderstanding of how a spell works or how an ability stacks. But either way, it's your job to keep the game functional. This is where saying no is straightforward. The rules don't support it. The interaction isn't valid. The math doesn't work. You're not shutting down creativity, you're protecting fairness. Because if one player gets to operate outside the mechanics while the rest are playing by the book, you've broken the implicit contract of the game. The trick is to say no without embarrassment, without condensation, without turning it into a lecture. Just a clean, confident redirect. That doesn't work that way, but here's what you could try instead. Or, that combo is a little outside the scope of the system. Let's see if we can find a version that fits. Clarity, respect, structure. Now the second kind of no, and the harder one, is the tonal no. This is when a player introduces an idea, character, or action that doesn't fit the emotional register of the game. You're running gothic horror and someone wants to play a meme bard. You're running grounded political intrigue and someone says, I'm going to seduce the dragon using interpretive dance. You're 3 sessions into a survival story and a player suddenly starts acting like they're in a Saturday morning cartoon. This is where things get tricky, because technically they're not breaking any rules. They're playing their character, they're engaging, but they're cracking the tone, and tone is fragile. So how do we say no here? First, you call in the expectations. Remember how we talked about this being a serious campaign with darker themes? That idea is a little too far outside that for me. Can we reel it in a bit? You're not banning fun, you're protecting consistency, because once the tone fractures, immersion goes with it. If it keeps happening, if the same player keeps pushing the mood sideways, you don't escalate. You clarify. I think we're running 2 different games here. I want to make sure this is still the right table for you. That's not rejection. That's invitation. You're giving them a chance to recalibrate or to gracefully bow out. The third kind of no is the boundary no. This is the hardest one and the most important. This is when a player's request crosses a line. Maybe it's a scene that gets too graphic. Maybe it's a behavior that's disruptive or unsafe. Maybe it's a topic you or someone at the table doesn't want to explore. This is where saying no is non-negotiable. You don't need to justify it. You don't need to explain your trauma or debate your values. You can just say, that's not something we're going to do here. Or, that's outside the scope of what I'm comfortable running. Full stop. And if the player pushes, that's a different conversation. Because now it's not about a scene or mechanic, it's about trust. And you protect trust by holding the line, even if it's awkward, even if it costs you a seat, even if it makes the room go quiet for a moment. That quiet is better than the kind of silence that comes from someone feeling hurt, erased, or unsafe. Saying no in all 3 forms is a skill, and like any skill, it gets easier with use. Let's talk about delivery, because how you say no is just as important as when. A harsh no shuts things down. A vague no confuses people. But a clear, steady no, one that's confident without being combative, that's leadership. And the more you practice it, the more your players will trust it. The key is framing. A no without context feels like rejection, and a no with direction feels like guidance. You're not saying, you can't do that because I don't like it. You're saying, that doesn't work in this scene, but there's something that might. That redirect matters. It keeps the energy flowing. The players still feel engaged, still feel seen, but now they're working inside the boundaries instead of fighting against them. Let's take a moment at the table. A player says, I want to cast a spell that lets me mind control the king. And you know, mechanically, that's a nightmare. Tonally, it breaks the arc. Narratively, it short-circuits 3 sessions of diplomacy you've built. You don't say, nope, you can't do that. You say, the king has magical protections in place, high-level wards, divination countermeasures. That kind of control magic isn't going to land here, but if you want to influence him, maybe there's another angle. What if you tried negotiating with his advisor, or using your magic more subtly? Now it's a pivot, not a wall. You said no, but you've done it with respect, intention, and a clear path forward. And that's what players want. Not limitless freedom, not constant vetoes, just clarity, just a sense that the GM knows where the story's going, and their input is still valued, even when it needs a course correction. Let's look at another situation. A player says, can I punch this NPC in the middle of the peace talks? You could say yes, like Chaos Reign. But if you do, the tone of the game shifts. Everything you've built in terms of political tension dissolves. So you take a breath. You check in. You can absolutely try, but just so you know, that'll likely end the negotiations, damage your standing, and possibly start a war. Is that what you want your character to do? Now you've made the consequences visible. You've respected their agency, but you've also reminded them of the story they're part of. And if they still say yes, let them. But make sure the world reacts. Because that's the other side of saying no. Sometimes you don't say it directly. Sometimes you let the fiction say it for you. The guard draws his sword. The diplomat walks out. The consequences land, and the table learns something about the world. You're not a gatekeeper. You're a storyteller with boundaries. And when your players understand that, they stop testing the edges and start playing inside the shape. In the next segment, we'll dig into Session 0, where saying no early can prevent problems before they even reach your table. Session 0 is where your no becomes a blueprint, not a barricade. It's the single most powerful tool you have for reducing conflict, preventing mismatched expectations, and protecting your energy as a GM. And yet, so many people treat it like an optional prelude, a quick rules rundown before the real game starts. But Session 0 is where you build your yes and define your no. It's not about shutting things down. It's about showing the players the shape of the game they're entering and letting them choose to step inside. This is where you talk tone. You say, this is going to be a grounded, low-magic survival game. Or, we're leaning into a high fantasy pulp with big swings and fast pacing. Whatever the style, whatever the stakes, you name it out loud, because once it's said, you can point back to it when someone pushes past the edge. You also set your mechanical boundaries here. What books are allowed? Is multiclassing on the table? Any third-party content? Are there specific builds or options you want to keep out? This isn't you limiting creativity. This is you defining the sandbox. The players aren't guessing what they can bring. They're choosing to engage with a game that has shape, limits, and clear expectations. And when someone asks later, can I take this exploitive subclass I found on Reddit? You're not making a new rule in the spot. You're referencing what was already agreed to. And here's the best part. Players relax when they know where the edges are. They build characters that fit the world. They engage with trust. They stop seeing your no as rejection and start seeing it as consistency. That's the win. Now, Session 0 isn't just about rules and builds. It's also about table culture. This is where you talk about what kinds of humor are okay, how you handle PvP, how you want players to treat each other's spotlight moments. You don't need a manifesto, just a clear, calm explanation of what kind of energy helps the game thrive. If someone bristles at that, if they push back right out of the gate, that's a red flag, and it's a lot easier to part ways after Session 0 than it is 5 sessions deep, after the damage has already been done. I've run campaigns when I've said, this is a character-driven narrative game. If you're mostly here for tactical combat, it might not be the right fit. And sometimes someone walks. And I thank them, because they saved both of us hours of mismatched expectations and slow building resentment. Your session 0 isn't a sales pitch, it's a filter, and a good filter makes the game better for everyone who stays. Now we'll talk about what to do when a player keeps testing boundaries, even after you've said no. How do you hold the line without turning the table into a battleground? Sometimes you'll do everything right. You set expectations clearly. You'll explain your tone, your rules, your style. You'll say no early with kindness and clarity, and still, a player keeps pushing. They test the limits. They ignore the tone. They bring disruptive energy to the table session after session. They treat every no like a negotiation. When that happens, you have a decision to make, and it starts with one question. Is this a misunderstanding or a pattern? If it's a misunderstanding, start with curiosity. Pull them aside outside of game time. Say, hey, I've noticed a few moments where you've been pushing against the tone or rules we set. Is everything feeling okay with the game? You're not accusing. You're checking in. Maybe they didn't realize they were doing it. Maybe they're hoping for a different kind of experience. Maybe there's something underneath that needs to be named. That conversation alone fixes the problem more often than not. But if it's a pattern, if the player keeps pushing after you've clarified, then it's time to set the boundary directly. Not as a warning, not as a threat, as a decision. You say, I want to be clear. This is the game I'm running. The tone, the rules, the structure. If that's not working for you, I understand, but it's what I'm offering. You've given them a choice. Stay and engage with the group shape or step away. And if they keep pushing, you remove them. Not emotionally, not in anger, just professionally. Because here's the truth. Saying no isn't about being liked. It's about protecting the table, the group, the energy that makes the game possible. And the longer you allow someone to keep testing boundaries after you've set them, the more you're teaching the rest of the group that your no doesn't mean anything. And trust dies fast when that happens. I've removed players. Not often, but when I've had to, it's always been because the long, slow erosion of boundaries were hurting everyone else. And every time, the table improved. The tone reset. The energy returned. And more than once, players have messaged me after and said, thank you. I didn't realize how much that was weighing down the game. That's the power of a well-placed no. Not just for you, but for the group. In the next segment, we'll explore the moments when saying no might not be the right move, when it's actually better to say yes, or at least yes but, and how to know the difference. Let's talk about discernment, because the goal of this episode isn't to turn you into a reflexive no machine. Some of the best moments in tabletop storytelling comes from unexpected yeses. Moments where a player asks for something off script, and instead of shutting it down, you pivot, you lean in, and the story deepens. So how do you know the difference? When do you say no to protect the game, and when do you say yes to let it evolve? Start by listening for what's underneath the request. When a player says, can I jump off the roof and land on the ogre's back? They're not trying to break your encounter. They're asking for a moment, for a flourish, for a cinematic beat that will feel memorable. And most of the time, that's a yes. Maybe a yes with a roll. Maybe a yes with consequences. But a yes. But when the same player says, can I do that and avoid all damage, auto-crit, and move again before anyone else takes a turn? Now we're back in no territory. Not because they had an idea, because they're asking to bypass the fiction, the mechanics, and the fairness all at once. The rule of thumb is this: say yes to intention, not to exploitation. If the request is in service of a cool moment, a story beat, or a character trait, yes. If the request is in service of bypassing challenge, avoiding tension, or hogging spotlight, no. There's also the matter of tone. If you're running a dark, serious campaign and someone says, can I turn this ghost encounter into a Scooby-Doo chase scene? That's probably a no. But if you're running a pulpy, chaotic one-shot and someone says, can I surf this collapsing pillar like a wave? That might be the perfect yes. And sometimes a player will ask for something that's technically a no, but emotionally a yes. Maybe they want to do something that breaks the rules, but perfectly fits the arc. Maybe it's the paladin falling on their sword to save the innocent. Maybe it's the bard pulling off a con so risky it would never work by the book, and the whole table is holding its breath. That's when you fudge the numbers. That's when you bend the framework. That's when you say yes, not because it makes sense, but because it matters. That kind of yes, it doesn't break the game, it elevates it. The trick is being intentional, knowing when you're saying yes to strengthen the story, and when you're saying no to keep it from unraveling. In the next segment, we're going to dig into some of the most common places where GMs struggle to say no, and walk through exactly how to handle them when they show up at your table. Let's walk through some real scenarios. The kind that happen at almost every table eventually, and the kind that trip up even experienced GMs when it comes to saying no. Scenario 1, the edgy backstory that demands center stage. A player shows up with a character who is secretly the heir to a lost empire, marked by prophecy, hunted by a cult, and carrying a magic weapon that no one else can touch. None of this fits your setting. None of it was discussed during session 0, but now it's on your desk, and the player expects the campaign to bend around it. This is where you say no gently but clearly. There's a lot of big ideas here. I love the ambition, but this campaign isn't really built for chosen one arcs. If we scale this down, I can absolutely weave some of it in, but we need to keep the spotlight balanced. You're not rejecting their creativity, you're protecting the group. And if the player's response is, "But that's who my character is," then it's a sign that the table might not be a fit. And it's better to say that now than 4 sessions in when the resentment has started to spread. Scenario 2, mid-session PvP. One player says, "I want to steal from the cleric while they're sleeping," or "I'm going to stab the rogue in the back because I don't trust him." You see the red flags immediately. There was no prior agreement about PvP. This isn't a betrayal everyone saw coming. This is a player making a power move and expecting the narrative to follow. This is a firm no, not because you're avoiding conflict, but because surprise PvP without consent isn't drama, it's sabotage. You pause the game. You say, "We didn't agree to PvP at this table. If you want to play out conflict, let's find a way that keeps it safe and interesting for everyone. But I'm not allowing unilateral character sabotage." And if they argue, that's a conversation outside the session. Always. Scenario 3, the over-optimized build demanding spotlight. You've got one player who's clearly outpacing everyone else. Every combat is theirs. Every plan starts with them. The rest of the group is falling into the background. And now they're asking to take a new feature or item that would widen the gap even more. You say no, not because they've done anything wrong, but because you're stewarding group cohesion. You've already got a really strong build. I want to make sure the rest of the party still gets a chance to shine. Let's find something a little bit more balanced. And if they get defensive, you say, "This isn't about nerfing you, it's about supporting the group dynamic." Scenario 4, inappropriate content. This one's straightforward, but it shows up more often than it should. A player starts describing something graphic, sexual, or cruel, something outside the tone you set, something that makes the room go quiet in a bad way. You shut it down. That's not something we're including in this game. Let's move on. If they push, you end the session. You message them privately. You hold the line. And if they still don't get it, you remove them immediately. No debate. Because no table, no matter how fun, is worth sacrificing safety for. These situations all feel different, but they have one thing in common. The no protects the experience. Not your ego, not your control, the experience. Next, we're going to talk about what happens after you say no, how to rebuild trust, invite collaboration, and make sure your table still feels like a place of possibility, even when limits are in place. So you've said no, the moment has passed, the scene has moved on, and now there's a quiet tension at the table. Maybe someone looks disappointed. Maybe a player seems checked out. Maybe the vibe feels colder than it did a minute ago. This is where the real work begins, because saying no isn't just a decision, it's a moment of leadership, and how you follow up determines whether your table walks away feeling respected or rejected. The first thing to do is normalize it. Saying no shouldn't feel like punishment. It shouldn't be rare or dramatic. It should be part of the rhythm of your game, like dice rolls, like spotlight shifts, like pacing decisions. You don't need to apologize for it. You just need to be steady, consistent, kind. If you sense that someone's upset, don't ignore it. Check in after the session, quietly, privately. Hey, I noticed that moment didn't quite land the way we hoped. How are you feeling about it? You're not reopening the decision. You're opening a door. You're reminding the player that they matter, even when their idea didn't fit. And often, that's all it takes, just a little space to be heard. The second thing you do is offer forward motion. When you say no to an idea, try to say yes to a new one soon after. Let the player take a meaningful action. Let their next move land. Let them feel like the story is still theirs to shape. Because no is a boundary, not a dead end. That's the balance. That's the magic. Your no isn't just a guardrail. It's a way of keeping the game focused. And so that yeses, the good ones, the earned ones, actually matter. Here's the third piece. Celebrate when it works. When a player adjusts course after a no and leans into the scene anyway, call it out. When someone checks in with you mid-session to say, would this work or should I try something different? Thank them. When the table finds a creative solution that honors the tone you've built, tell them it landed, because reinforcement builds culture. Your table learns from what you praise, not just what you allow. And finally, remind yourself you're allowed to be human. You're going to get it wrong sometimes. You're going to say yes when you should have said no. You're going to shut something down and realize later it could have worked with a tweak. That's okay. Talk about it. Adjust. Learn out loud. Your players don't expect perfection. They expect presence, honesty, a sense that you're trying to build something intentionally with them. And that's exactly what saying no, when done right, provides. In our final segment, we'll bring everything together and talk about what it means to run a table where no is respected, yes is earned, and trust runs in both directions. Let's bring it home. Saying no isn't about shutting things down. It's about shaping something meaningful. It's about protecting the tone, the pacing, the vibe, and the trust that makes tabletop role-playing more than just dice rolls and character sheets. When you say no to a disruptive tone, you're saying yes to immersion. When you say no to a broken mechanic, you're saying yes to fairness. When you say no to unsafe behavior, you're saying yes to safety, to presence, to emotional clarity. And when you say no with kindness and confidence, your players don't lose faith. They gain it. They start to see that the table has edges, not to limit them, but to hold them, to give their choices shape, to make their risks feel real, to make their victories land. Because no, used well, is what makes yes matter. Our run campaigns where the most powerful moments came not from improvisation or wild creativity, but from a player pausing, looking at me and asking, would this work? And me saying, not quite, but this might. That back and forth, that shared understanding, that's what we're really doing here. You are not a robot. You're not a customer service agent. You're a guide, a builder, a weaver of stories. And part of that work, maybe the most underappreciated part, is knowing when to hold the line. So say no. Say it early. Say it clearly. Say it with care. And then open the door to what is possible, to what fits, to what supports the experience you're all here to build. Because a table with boundaries isn't less creative, it's more. Because creativity thrives when it knows what it's building on. Next time on Dice and Quills, we're going to explore the structure behind one-shots, what makes them tick, what separates a satisfying one-shot from a forgettable one, and how to run them with precision, depth, and just enough space for a story to breathe. If you found something useful in this episode, consider sharing the podcast, rating it, or supporting the show. It helps more than you know. And if you've had to say no, in a hard moment, in a subtle one, in a way that changed your table, I'd love to hear your story. Tag me, message me, let's keep the conversation going. Until next time, sharpen your quills, ready your dice, and remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for your table is draw the line.